and welcome to Lighting the Path, AAPI leaders powering up the energy justice movement. I'm Shao Zhong, Creative Director at Green 2.0. At Green 2.0, we recognize that people of color are the most impacted by environmental problems, but least represented in the environmental sector, especially in positions of power. Our organization works to increase diversity in environmental movement and ensure that environmental organizations and foundations are inclusive and equitable. From Hawaii to the Philippines, islands have a rich history of power, honor, and connecting to the natural world. For centuries, island communities have honored the planet and fought to protect their resources. Despite facing the challenges of colonialism and exploitation, these communities have fostered a movement for energy justice. During today's event, you will hear from leaders in the energy justice movement discuss how their community inspired their work in the field, the spirit of fighting for utility justice, and how they are working to revolutionize energy to better serve their communities. If you have questions throughout the event, please put them in the Q&A box. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Energy Allies for inviting us to be part of this important event. I will now pass it to our moderator for today's conversation, Kristy Drutman.
Hi, everyone. Super happy to be here. Excited for this conversation today. I'm Kristy Drutman. I am the founder of Brown Girl Green, as well as the co-founder of the Green Jobs Board, which is a company connecting job seekers and employers together to build a more equitable and sustainable future. And I'm really excited to be moderating today's conversation because I'm very passionate about energy justice, especially when it comes to storytelling around energy justice. As a Filipina American myself, I feel a deep responsibility of being a part of the wider diaspora to think about, not just what's happening here in the US, but what's also happening abroad in the global South with a lot of the communities that all of our panelists are a part of. And I love that we have a diversity across the AAPI spectrum on today's discussion today, who will all be discussing their own takes on what energy justice means to them, as well as this discussion of how our cultural identities inform, our activism, our politics, our vision for the future. And so I would love for us to kick off today's discussion by introducing ourselves. And so obviously I started with myself, and I'll put some links in the chat for you all to check out more about what I'm up to. And I would love to pass it to Steph to kick us off.
Thank you, Kristy, who has done so much for storytelling in the climate space. I'm really glad to be on the panel with y'all. I'm Steph Speirs. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Solstice. Solstice connects households and businesses to community shared solar farms. And our mission is to get clean energy for every community. Since 2014, we've been especially focused on increasing access to low to moderate income Americans, getting access to solar and community solar. Prior to Solstice, I worked in India and Pakistan on solar energy projects and deployments. And then prior to that, I did a very different career in government and campaigning.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that introduction, Steph. And next we'll go to Councilwoman Keani Rawlins. If you're able to unmute, Councilwoman. Yeah, you're next.
So sorry about that. Aloha mai kako. I'm Councilwoman Keani Rawlins Fernandez. The aina that has fed me and nourished me is Molokai. It's the piko of our archipelago, our Pai'aina, Hawaii. I have been a council member for the past 4.5 years. And I've been working with our community from before I got into the council on energy independence for our island. Our island population is over 62% Native Hawaiian, Kanaka Maoli. And we continue to look at ways how we can be self-sufficient, and energy is one of them. And I've been their biggest cheerleader as their council member for our community in ensuring that everyone is taken care of in that way. Mahalo.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction. And next we will have Crystal from Energy Democracy Project.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. It's such an honor to be on this panel with everyone, amazing people doing amazing work in energy justice. My name is Crystal Huang. I use any pronouns with the Energy Democracy Project. I personally grew up in Taiwan, and I grew up in the ancestral philosophy of Taoism, of being in the flow. And being in the flow comes in a lot of contradiction with the way that our society works, and dreaming into the future where we can be in balance and in harmony with nature is in many ways also in contradiction with a lot of how Taiwan as a island is working in the economy that exists and survives in the globalization. And so for me, growing up, navigating through the contradiction, I wouldn't say perfectly, nobody can be perfect here, trying to figure out what's the best way to actually get to the future. So at the Energy Democracy Project, we have a shared vision, believing that a just climate future requires each community to be empowered to make its local energy development decision in harmony with Earth's ecosystem. By restoring this balance, our communities can begin to authentically meet our energy needs ourselves. Really wanted to highlight the fact that this is not about renewable energy, not about fossil fuel, not about fuel source, but really about who gets to have the power to control their own destiny. And in many ways, as I learned from my elders in my family, it's all about us planning to be sufficient. We have a plan, a vision. We need to figure out plan B, plan C to figure things out. And so I'm very happy to be here to chat more about how this connects with the work of energy justice with y'all.
Amazing. Well, as you can see, we have a very incredible, diverse set of panelists, but all of them have obviously demonstrated a lot of leadership in the field of energy justice. All of them have really taken up that space and have addressed that in a lot of meaningful ways. And to kick us off with that discussion, I mean, you don't always see the most representation of AAPI in the energy field or in the energy space. So to have a whole powerhouse panel of, you know, women of color who are leading that charge, I think it's really important for there to be a discussion on how did you get there? You know, how did you actually carve out your own pathway in this work towards energy justice? And I would love the councilwoman to start off with that, because I think it's very interesting that you carved your own path in a way that is addressing politics, addressing local power, right? Addressing democracy at the source. So I'd love to talk with you a little bit more on how did you carve out that path for yourself? And not just that, how did you step into your power once you were there?
Oh, mahalo for that question. Any power I have comes from our community. It's community centered, and it's community that asked me to run for this office. And Molokai is my everything. My community is my everything. We are one ohana. Our population is about 7,500 people. And so most of us are related or grew up together. We have generational families. And serving our community has filled me with so much purpose. And it fuels my fire to make sure that their needs are taken care of. And what has happened inadvertently, but we knew all along, is that when we have achieved so much in our community on Molokai, it has been inspiring other communities on the other islands to take hold of their community power. And that's been so inspiring for me. I'm not sure if everyone has seen in the news, but one side of our island on Maui in our county has been completely leveled, as in ash. They have no power on the west side of Maui right now. And it's part of it is because of, you know, the centralized energy systems. And we're just at the mercy of these electric companies whose CEO is being paid over $5 million. While people who are just paying for oxygen and to survive their utility bills, struggle to pay their monthly electric bills. And that's the, disparity and injustice that we're seeing a lot. And to have that independence and control of our future and our destiny is something that has driven me from when I was young. And that's I've always followed my na'au, my kupuna, my ancestors, their kahea, their calling, their guidance, and that's how I've that's the path I followed.
That was really powerful. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and thoughts. And we shared a link in the chat about ways that you can support the community in Maui and the broader community in Hawaii. And I think it's really, unfortunately, timely and fitting for this conversation around what is at stake. What is at stake for our communities? What is at stake for the people that we care most about? And, as much as there are these academic terms of energy democracy and energy independence, which we're going to dive a bit more into, at the end of the day, it comes down to the fact that communities around the world are energy insecure and need to have that support and need their own sovereignty, need their own support to understand that the system is not currently designed to necessarily support frontline communities that are the most vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis. And so when we talk about what we're going to dive a bit deeper into in today's conversation, we have to understand that this is real people's lives on the line and it's happening today. And energy justice is not just a nice to have. It comes down to things around food security, livelihood, public health, so on and so forth, to actually be able to keep people's lights on, to allow them to feed themselves, to keep their communities safe. So I really appreciate you grounding us in the reality of the state of where the world currently is, and that it's all of our responsibility to really understand that these issues are timely and critical and are happening right now. So I really appreciate you sharing your heart and your story with us as well. So moving to our other amazing panelists, who I believe also must have really profound stories in this space. I'd love, Steph, if you could go into your journey of how you carved your path in this space as well.
I've had, I think, 10 different jobs in a decade. And so want to just encourage everyone on this call to be okay with starting over, starting fresh. And the first time I worked in energy, I was a 30-year-old intern in Pakistan working on solar microgrids and solar home solutions. And I went to Pakistan because it was the only place I could find a job, because it was hard to find a job in more popular places to go to. And I landed in Pakistan and I was just blown away by the capacity for renewable energy. And that, in Pakistan, it was a conflict-ridden area. And there was one headline in Time magazine that said people are worried about the Taliban and terrorists in Pakistan, but what they should be really worried about is the fact that no one can get access to electricity. And just energy is so fundamental to our daily lives. And yet so few people have access to clean energy. And there's a lot of people in the world that don't have access to energy and on the grid at all. I am very lucky to also have been born and raised in Hawaii. I am not native Hawaiian like Councilwoman Keani Rawlins, but I was born and raised child of immigrant parents in Hawaii. My mother immigrated from Korea, and she was a single mom of 3 kids, raising 3 kids on a salary, a minimum wage salary, which is very hard to do, which so many people in Hawaii do. And so growing up and seeing my mom struggle to pay the electricity bill, the rental bill, and getting evicted and having to leave our apartments in the middle of the night made me realize, there's such a divide between the haves and the have-nots, and the line that separates the have and the have-nots is the birth lottery. It's not any skill or talent, and opportunity is universal. Talent is universal, but opportunity is not. And even the child of immigrant parents who struggled so much in Hawaii, even living that life, you see the way that Native Hawaiians live in Hawaii, who on the west side of Oahu, where I'm from, those are where the solar companies and the wind companies try to build solar projects, but they don't work to get community engagement. They don't work to get community input. And so now you have this really interesting consequence, which is that Native Hawaiians are like, you cannot build in our backyard anymore unless you include us. And when I talk to my Native Hawaiian friends on the West Side about what would cause you to support solar, they're like, include us, give us some of the profits, let us be a part of this clean energy transition. And that's not what's happening. And so the organization that we started, Solstice, works to get solar to low-income households, but we also work to get developers and financiers to engage communities from day one of a solar project, and to give some of their profits back to disadvantaged communities. Because unless we share the super lucrative profitability of the clean energy industry with people who have been left out to date, we will not have an equitable clean energy transition, and we're only going to replicate the fossil fuel inequities that we see today. So much, I think there's a lot of optimism for where we are. We can change the future. What we do today changes tomorrow, but we have to work harder to include the people who have been left behind in the clean energy transition, or else it will not be a durable and sustainable transition.
Yeah, 100%. And I think if we are not recognizing, they always say when we're talking about equity gaps, we always have to understand who is and who isn't in those conversations. And at the end of the day, when we're designing policies or systems, if it's not addressing those who have the least amount of access, what are you really achieving at the end of the day? You're not raising the standard. You're in fact creating more barriers to entry, which is going to continue to create more wider distributed inequalities across the board. So I really appreciate you highlighting that, and that your work has been really dedicated towards breaking down those barriers actively. And last but not least, Crystal, we definitely want to dive into your story of how did you carve out the path that led you to the work you do today?
Yeah, I think best way to start is that everything I've done as young as I can remember is driven by curiosity. I'm always asking the question of why and how this happens. Why is there a mountain here? Why is there a country? Why are there people who are sleeping on the street and we have a home? All these questions. And a lot of times the answer is, it's just how it is. It's always been like this. And I've never really been satisfied by that answer. And I just kept asking why. And the asking of the why got me very interested in trying to figure out how to address the imbalance of nature that's going on, that human activity has created. Because I say that in a very careful way, that we are part of nature. It's not us causing harm to nature. We are nature too, but then we are creating an imbalance. And so from there, I started to learn, I went into the field of environmental science, atmospheric science, and try to figure out how to be part of the climate solutions. And of course, with that, when thinking about what is the future I want to build into, the dominant society's answer is renewable energy. So I got myself into renewable energy space and working at the largest solar panel manufacturers in the world, and started incubating startups that addresses renewable energy adoption and utility problems to help get more of these technology included. And then I got actually pulled into a film project to try to create some social change and get people thinking about the fact that we already have the technology that we need. We don't need to be debating whether climate change is real or not. Like, these technology helps create better livelihood for us for using a technology. But then, of course, the technology is expensive. This was back in 2013. 10 years ago, even today is expensive. Like, solar is expensive, electric vehicle is expensive. How do you get people who cannot afford to be part of it? How do you create a all-encompassing program that enables everyone to be part of it, which includes, of course, healthy eating, growing your own food. And so, as well as part of this, continue to ask why, following the guidance of the people who have done a lot of work around me. And of course, when you're in a renewable energy industry, most of them are white men. And I'm not pointing that out as in white men are bad. I'm pointing it out as there's different perspective and lived experience and background and culture and understanding of the world. So as part of that effort, I continue to ask why, and it got me connected to community-based solutions. So for the first time, it completely blew my mind away. I had always thought the world is really about, the solution is all about government, nonprofit, or for-profit, and that is about it. And when I learned about community-based solution, I realized this is the answer. I did not know. I realized that climate change is not the problem. The imbalance is the problem. And imbalance is not just climate change. It is everything that's distracting us from addressing, quote unquote, addressing climate change, as people who are in the climate movement would be thinking about. Like, the so-called distraction would be racial justice issue, displacement issue, poverty, lack of education, immigration crisis, you name it, the inability to pay the bills, food access, all of these things is what creates, it is actually rooted in the same problem that came from climate change. And through a continuation of exploration of my curiosity, I learned a pyramid, which I'll share later at some time on this call, the pyramid that actually is the source of the problem. So from that, I realized that the only way to address this pyramid, which ends up is the power behind the centralized energy system that Councilwoman Keani mentioned, like, we have to figure out how to put power into the hands of the people. I had no idea what the solution looked like back then. I had no idea what the problem was, really. I didn't know that pyramid existed. But I knew that the solution is in when you put the power into the hands of the people, and that got me into the energy democracy work.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And, I'm about to toss the next question at you because I think it's very relevant. And that question is breaking down terms for people. A big part of this conversation around how are we going to create power grids and spaces that center localized community run energy sources is starting to understand these terms around energy democracy and energy independence. And so I would love for you all, but we'll start with Crystal, to break down those terms. What do you define as energy democracy versus energy independence? What do those terms mean to you, and like, what is the vision behind them? So we'll start with you and then we'll pass it to the other panelists.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, and this is just the meaning to me and the people I work with closely. So for energy democracy, it's really important for us to really understand that energy democracy is not just about where you get the power from. It's about how we consume it, how we relate to it, and how we govern it. So this is not just about whether this is clean energy or not, because if you just look at whether the electrons is produced as clean, you don't really look at the devices and the entire life cycle and the extraction that goes into creating these things. The contradiction around, I'm sure a lot of people on the call here are very well aware of the contradiction around the cobalt mining and lithium mining. And of course, that's on top of just the process of producing solar panels. And a lot of times we tend to get moved by the feeling of climate emergency, and we say, well, it's better than fossil fuels, so let's just go with it, without really taking a moment to slow down and think about how are we going in with it that is not repeating the same way we're going with it, like what Steph said, same way, repeating the same fossil fuel way, but just changing the technology. So for energy democracy, it's really important to really focus on the people. Who is in control? Who is governing? And what is our relationship with each other? What is our relationship with energy? Energy is not just this thing that you buy from the wall or you buy it from the pump. Energy is not this thing that you take from nature. Energy, as movement generation and nonprofit that does a lot of popular education about movement building says, energy is the life and labor of the living system. Sounds a little spiritual, but if you take a moment and think about, if I ask you a question right now, what is energizing you today? I bet you your answer is probably going to be something around your family, your loved ones, young people, animals, nature, music, art, food. And I bet you are not going to say clean energy. You're not going to say solar panels or fossil fuel or gas or Green New Deal or whatever policy that us somehow as climate activists, we somehow jump so much into focusing and talking about the stuff that the engineers, the lawyers, and the financiers are focusing on and forgetting about who we are as humans and the fact that we are here to love and care. So energy democracy in many ways is to honor what we are as humans, as loving beings, to be as part of the interconnected web of life. So energy democracy is recognizing the interconnection that we have. So for me, when it comes to energy independence, personally, I have a lot of issue with the word. I recognize in the reality of colonization, in the reality of extraction, we want to separate from them. We want to separate from extraction. So the feeling of the need for independence from that and self-sufficient is extremely important. And I honor and I support, and I will also use those words and say, yes, we need those. But as we say that, I also encourage, how do we say these things, also recognizing that we need to celebrate the interdependence that we have with each other, because no matter what, we are going to be depending and connected to them. Whether you want it or not, you can go off grid, but you're still going to be in some sort of system in this world with extraction. So that's how I see the difference between energy democracy and energy independence for me.
Amazing. Thank you for defining and breaking that down. I would love the other panelists to weigh in on that. Either of you can start.
So to me, energy democracy is the idea that communities should have a say and should have agency in shaping their energy future. And then that's the ideal end state, as Crystal so articulately said. Whereas another term that we talk a lot about in the industry is energy justice. And it's about achieving this goal of having equity in both the social and the economic participation in the energy system. So it's the idea that not only can disadvantaged and under-resourced communities finally get some economic benefit from the clean energy industry, but it's also that they can participate socially in the decision-making of the energy industry. And there's really two fundamental concepts of justice. It's recognition of the inequities that exist right now, and it's also remediation of those inequities going into the future. How are we going to make it better? How are we going to make it more equal? And one of the biggest ways we can do that is focus on inclusion in the clean energy industry. So for instance, very specific example, 4 out of 5 Americans cannot put solar on their own home. They can't do it because they don't have the right rooftop. They don't own their home. They're a renter. There's a tree covering the roof is facing the wrong way, or they don't have the right FICO credit score to get access to financing to get solar on their home. And they don't have the upfront costs for it. And, FICO credit scores are effectively the modern form of redlining, in which we're excluding an entire populations from participating in finance because of some objective measure of creditworthiness. But it's not an objective credit measure. FICO was invented in 1956. It measures whether you pay your mortgages and your credit card bills on time, but it doesn't measure your utility bill payment. It doesn't measure your rental bill payment. It doesn't measure your cell phone bill payment, all of which low-income communities and communities of color have more than higher income communities. And so fundamentally what we're talking about with energy justice and energy democracy is changing the paradigms and the systems in which we're living in which there are winners and losers, and the losers continue to be those without capital or those with who are born in the birth lottery unfairly.
And Councilwoman, would you like to weigh in on this question as well?
I think Crystal and Stephanie really captured the definition of the two terms very well. So I was thinking that perhaps I could help our audience by sharing 3 stories that happened on Molokai. About 20 years ago, there was an idea that big wind, so the big windmills would be installed on Molokai, where our native bird habitats are, seabird habitats, and that there would be it would be a multi-billion-dollar project where the power lines would go to Oahu. So our island would be exploited, would take on all the burden, would have our native species killed for another island's insatiable appetite for electricity. Our community fought back, and we were successful in fighting our own government, our own elected officials, to not support this project. But it took so many people volunteering their time, trying their best to convince our own elected officials to not go through with this project. This spurred the community to want to own our own systems. So when we're talking about independence for ourselves, we're talking about ownership, management for ourselves, this decision-making on what the costs are, where the profits go. The second is out of the Big Wind project came the Community Renewable Energy Project. There was a bid by the utility itself. They called it a self-build team, and that they were going to have a China wall separate these two. But they're one company. The self-build team, whatever profits they make, profits go to the utility itself. There's no separating. There's a clear conflict, but they're being allowed to bid against our community for this project that would provide energy to 1/4 of our population. It would satisfy the need of 1/4 of our population's energy needs. And the utility, who is a monopoly in Hawaii, were trying to bid against our community. Our community rose up, went to the Public Utilities Commission, and fought argued our case. And thankfully, we had good commissioners at the time, and they agreed and mandated that the utility work with our community. They ultimately withdrew their self-build team. Our community continues to volunteer its time to put together this solar farm. And it took about 2.5 years, but we were able to, with partners like Shake Energy, we were able to put in a proposal, and our proposal was selected. And so our community received that huge win. The third story I'll quickly wrap up with is that we have Hawaiian Homestead, where a lot of our native Hawaiians live on Molokai and other islands. And many are without electricity. It costs $40,000 to put a utility pole from the road onto your property. People cannot afford that. So they've been using generators to work their children's asthma machines. And the generator in one family's property set off a fire, and it destroyed everything on their property. And our Ho'ahu Energy Co-op stepped in and built a solar generator for them. And now they're able to have a refrigerator. They've never had a refrigerator before. So these are the things, these are the real stories when we're talking about that when we talk about energy independence, energy democracy, energy justice, like these are the real stories. Mahalo.
Thank you so much for sharing those stories. I thought that was a really brilliant way to bring all of these things together and to show, how community ultimately has to come together and ask for these things, right? Because the system is not designed to give it to people. In fact, the system is designed to scam people, as Steph talked about. The system is designed to price gouge and to make these things so inaccessible to where only people with a lot of access to wealth and education and resources can actually know that there's other options, right? And I really want to talk a little bit more about that on the storytelling piece, on educating the community on these options. And I'd love to talk a little bit more on like how each of you have kind of approached that in your work, like through community advocacy and education. How have you felt like there's been effective messaging that actually resonates with the communities that you work with? I'd love to dive a little bit more into what kind of storytelling works, like makes people understand that this is something that their community has the agency to dive into, to fight for. Would love to hear y'all's thoughts on that. I would love if Crystal, you could kick that off if you have thoughts on that at all.
Yeah, so many stories to share on that. So in fact, there's so many stories within the Energy Democracy Project, which is a collaboration of 40 and growing energy democracy practitioners across the country from Alaska to Puerto Rico, really working for the energy democracy that we're talking about here to build a movement. And we recognize and realize that, oh my goodness, no matter the diversity of our work, we are facing the same thing and we're working towards the same thing. I'll say even more specifically, we're facing the same thing in the way that for anyone who's fighting against investor-owned utilities on rate hikes or trying to get them to get renewable energy policy on board in a way that actually empowers the community, they're actually using the exact same playbook through the industry association that's funded by the ratepayers, all of us. And so we're talking about an entire industry using the same thing against all of us who are trying to build a future with a vision that is so unique to all of us. While we're so disparate and the resources so little, what do? And storytelling became something that we realized that we need to be investing in. And we created this framework, which I'll quickly show on the screen, with the pyramid that I mentioned to you earlier when I was sharing my own personal story, the very story that made me realize that climate change is not the problem. Climate change is only one symptom of a much bigger problem. And the problem here we see is our community right here, living down in just minding our own business, trying to survive. And here we have on the top, the people up top in the Wall Street most of the time, not all the time, puppeteering what's happening. And I'm not trying to talk about the conspiracy here, like the control, so much of that is in a small few people. And we're using Wall Street because when we're talking about storytelling, it's important to pick one villain. But if you talk about any small number of people that's at the very top, controlling all of the money, and then making us depend on the very thing that's killing us, making us remove ourselves from the land, remove ourselves from the ability to grow our own food, to be in community self-determination, remove ourselves to be able to be in balance, which for indigenous people for thousands of years have been, to remove the people so that we have to rely on understanding of energy being this thing we have to buy to pay the bill for. And yes, of course, fossil fuel is really difficult, but I need to drive, so I cannot live without it. And then we also rely on electricity to survive, because all the devices now, not only our medical devices or refrigeration relies on electricity. Now we're talking about our mobility, electric vehicle, even ability to cook is all electrified. And so our dependency, and I'm not saying electrification is bad here. I'm saying dependency, what is the relationship, is now getting more and more concentrated to the people who's holding the oligarchy, that's holding everything, so that we can continue to give them money. And that is the pyramid that I'm talking about. That is the source of climate change. That is the source of all of the injustice that we're seeing, the lack of access to food, to healthcare, to education. All of this is the story that we're trying to tell for people to understand what is behind. So that when we understand, I live in California right now, in Northern California. The past few years, we have wildfires, and these are wildfires not just because of climate change. These are wildfires sparked by transmission line, bringing renewable energy from solar panels, wind, and hydro to our communities in Oakland, California, that's burning down the state, killing dozens of people. And that is the contradiction that we are navigating through, and the stories that we have to tell people to say, if you're experiencing power shutoff, this is not just about turning it back on and then continue affirming the system. The key question we have to ask ourselves is, how can we create material condition, improve the material conditions of our communities without affirming the current system, is the key things that we're trying to work with through the work of the grassroots organizing and consciousness shifting to understand what that means. So to close, I do want to share, like in chat, we'll drop in the link. There's a newsletter that we recently sent out about the renewable energy tyranny that is coming to play. As the fossil fuel is not enough, we really need to understand what is the false solution and what is a real solution. And the key question here is, what is our relationship? Is the current relationship still in extraction for power? And I'm talking about power, political, financial, and literal power. So with that, that's my answer for the type of storytellings that we tell. And through that, you can apply that. Looking at this pyramid, I'm sure you can tell the story and see like what exactly needs to happen.
Well, I love the illustration. I love the colors. I love the way that it's laid out. We definitely need to make that go viral on the interwebs for sure. I think a lot more people need to learn about the pyramid and the concept. It's the first time I have really seen it visualized that way. Of course, I've know the concepts, but to have it panned out that way, I think makes it a lot more accessible to understand exactly how those things are connected together, which I think is really cool. Steph, do you have any thoughts or stories you'd like to weigh in on effective messaging or storytelling about this concept?
Yeah, I think we can learn so much from behavioral economics data around why people make the decisions they do. And so, Crystal, that was so inspiring. I'm going to show a chart of data. And this comes from RARE, which is a behavioral economics institute. They do climate studies, and they see how people's behavior changes. And they looked at this question: what makes people take climate action? And the climate action they defined as installing solar panels, buying an EV, getting offsetting your carbon usage, or contracting for green energy. And they first looked at, does your political orientation change whether you take climate action? And they found that nope, it does not change whether you take climate action. So whether you're a Democrat or a Republican does not predict whether you take climate action. So they looked at, okay, what about, do you believe in climate change? If you believe in climate change, does that affect whether you take climate action? Sadly, that does not. It is not a predictive measure of whether you take climate action. So a lot of people out there believe in climate change. They know it exists, and they still aren't taking climate action. What about what others think should be done? Does that influence whether you will take climate action? Actually, not really. Slightly more, but not really. What others think you should do doesn't affect your views. So what actually, what about what should be done? Like when you get told, stop flying so much, vote for elected officials that support climate, and you're told this should happen for climate change, does that change whether you take climate action? Not really. So even knowing what the solutions are doesn't change whether you as an individual take climate action. Do other people's behavior change whether you take climate action? Far and away, that is the most predictive indicator of whether we take climate action. It's the most predictive indicator according to a separate Yale study that shows, why do people install solar on their rooftop? They install solar on the rooftop not because they care about the environment, not because they want to save money, but because they did it because their friends and neighbors are doing it. And people buy EVs if they think their friends and neighbors are doing it too. And I find this actually so inspiring in that we can actually have a tangible effect on whether people around us take climate change action. if we set a good example and if we mobilize and collective action our way to climate solutions. People want to do what other people are doing and they want to do what they think is cool. And so it's such a good lesson in how we get people to sign up for clean energy solutions. Our job is to sign up people for community solar, and community solar is a product where you don't have to put solar on your own rooftop. It's a guaranteed savings on your electricity bill. And even then, people are sometimes skeptical of signing up because they're like, it sounds too good to be true. Are you sure? Are you sure I should sign up? It sounds like a scam. And so we found that if we show up to someone's doorstep and we're a stranger and we're like, hey, Kristy, you don't know me, sign up for community solar. It's going to save you 10% off your electricity bill. You're going to sign up at a 1 to 2% conversion rate. But if you get told by your buddy, maybe like an influencer like Kristy is online, if you get told by someone you trust to sign up for community solar, people sign up for community solar at a 30 to 50% conversion rate. So truly, like, being ambassadors, community organizing, like showing people the way, living by example, leading by example, those are super tangible ways to change the world. And sometimes I think we can get into our climate anxiety, death spiral, because it's can often be a sad state of the world. But I find these studies so helpful and our statistics so helpful to encourage myself to get through the hard times in climate anxiety and climate worries, about how like we can actually make a difference by mobilizing and getting people to do the right thing, which is stop using fossil fuels.
Amazing. Thank you so much for laying out that chart for us. And I agree. I think it is about being able to create the conversation that like this is going to be the standard moving forward. We don't need to live in a world that is centered around extraction, and it needs to be focused on the collective. And in order to create that consciousness shift, it's important to have more storytellers that are connecting the dots for people. And as Councilwoman Keani Rawlins has been an incredible storyteller in today's call, I would love if you could, also answer that question of just, obviously you are an incredible storyteller, but with the youth on your island and in your community, how have you been working to inspire the youth? Like, what has that been looking like in an intergenerational dialogue, so that way they can carry those lessons forward as well? I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Mahalo nui for that question. So as we organized as a community to realize this goal of community ownership of our energy systems, we recognized that we needed to build capacity simultaneously within our community so that we have the skill set to install, maintain, construct, manage, sign up subscribers to our shared energy, shared solar system. And as a council member, I funded the effort to build that capacity, workforce development. And Ho'ahu Energy Co-op, they took it and they ran with it, and they found so many different partners, like the university in Arizona, different community groups like Makahana Ka'ike and Makaha Learning Center. And from there, in realizing and asserting our community's power, instead of being in a sit and wait pattern or sit and wait mode, we proactively worked on developing a plan of what energy projects and storage projects our community wants to see, and this is it. And it was our youth and the next generation leaders that took that project and they ran with it. And they went to all the different community events to collect different information. And we got the most creative ideas. We have a reservoir that we're thinking that our community wants to put floating solar on, so that we're not taking up Aina, so that it prevents evaporation from our reservoir. We're looking at hydro storage. We're looking at ways that our community doesn't shift burdens and environmental impacts on other vulnerable communities like our own, as we look to partner with people who put together systems so that they're not destroying another island nation's home, their environment. And so it's been incredibly inspiring working with our youth. They really are our next leaders, and giving them that space to take leadership has been one of the highlights, for sure. Mahalo.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And, you know, there's been such an incredible conversation of visioning for the future. And I wanted to, you know, open up and bring in some questions from the audience. And if anyone else wants to submit questions, please submit it in the Q&A box. And in the meantime, wanted to share with you all this question that we just received, which is, what have been some of the most successful specific strategies in forcing or encouraging, but probably forcing policymakers to support a strategy of energy democracy? And anyone can answer this. So just specific strategies that have worked for you all. Yes, go ahead.
Mahalo, Kristy, and mahalo for that question, Prakash. As an elected official, what I've found to be an effective strategy is organizing our community and working directly with our elected officials. There in our communities, so many people that really need the help, that really need policy change, oftentimes are the ones that don't call my office. So we need to elevate those voices. We need to get out into community and mobilize those community members that are often the most affected by a lot of this work. And sometimes, you know, because of the oppressive system that we live in, a lot of people can't even imagine what's possible. And so in pointing to other communities that have been successful and have won, you know, beat the utility in certain, has really been inspiring for a lot of other communities. And so when we look to others, it builds confidence that if they can, we can too. And so as a Molokai community, that's something that we're a small community. We're only 7,500 people. And so we try to, that's why I'm sharing this, because I want people to be able to look to what we're doing as just a tiny community and say, they've been winning. We can do this too.
I love that so much. And, you know, another question we got in the chat, but I'm going to remix it to how I think would be interesting based on what other people have shared, especially Steph. You know, I thought that was really interesting that regardless of people's politics, there are ways that we can hook people into the conversation, right? And depending on those politics may decide, you know, how willing you are to listen to certain types of messaging versus others. And so I'm just wondering, like, you know, what do you feel are those like win-win-win types of messages that show that energy democracy has co-benefits? And, you know, Crystal, I'd love for you to answer this too, like these co-benefits of like, you know, talking about like energy efficiency, talking about like being able to have cost savings, like what are some of those other like types of messaging that you think could really come across to like, yeah, get people really excited about the concept of energy democracy?
We live in a world right now where it's easy to get into arguments about us versus them. And even all of us here on this panel, like we have deeply shared values about humanism and equality and equity that are not necessarily how the rest of the world views the energy industry. Like a lot of the people who are building solar projects are developers and financiers, and they very much have the mindset of commercial real estate developers, not people who are first concerned about social justice and energy justice. And so how do we bridge that gap? I think a lot of it is about remembering that everyone cares about their family. They care about their family's health. They deeply love their community, however they define that. And they're willing to open up the boundaries of their community if they see some kind of shared commonalities. Like ultimately all people are the same. And I have a stepfather who is a pretty staunch Trump supporter, and like loving him has been one of the biggest lessons of my life, because you can truly bridge the divide on different political views if you focus on like health and love. And so one of the biggest lessons being a community organizer myself is that it is incumbent upon all community organizers and all activists to be cultural translators. Like we cannot just speak the language that we know how to speak, and we can't just divert to the values that feel comfortable to us. Like we have to learn to speak other people's language. So in order to build a solar company that is successful in this industry that is extremely capital driven, I've had to learn to speak the language of finance and real estate development in a way that's highly uncomfortable to me, but it allows me to be able to build empathy with developers and say, like, introduce these family stories that Councilwoman Keani Rawlins is so emphasizing, and bringing them to the developer and financier landscape. Like we need to be able to culturally translate, because climate change is an all hands on deck problem, and we need everyone. We even need the capitalists and the developers and the financiers to get on board with energy justice. And by telling them they're stupid and they're wrong and they have the wrong values, we're not going to get anywhere. And so it really does take that like humility to be able to come to a better future together. And I've learned that the hard way. And I think we could all in the social justice movement, rather than get into a circular firing squad, kind of see ourselves as more change agents, that our responsibility is to leave our sanctuaries and go out there and do the uncomfortable thing of helping other people see the value in imagining life beyond our own lifetimes. Like our ancestors' lifetimes and our grandchildren's lifetimes.
Oh, that was amazing. And this is our last question for the session. I wish we could talk about this for hours, which I'm sure we all could. But I would say, I really love this last note from Alice Sung. Thank you, Alice, for this question. The question is, how can we keep this discussion around energy democracy, independence, and resilience for, by, and of our communities at pace and scale on the islands and on the mainland? I think the way I want to position this question also is just like, how, if people get fired up, right? And they listen to this and they're like, wow, I want to get into this, but I'm not in one of your organizations or companies, et cetera, et cetera. Like, what is your recommendation for them to get started? Like, now they'll watch this webinar and then it's like, where do they go from there? Where should they look? What should they read? What should they vision for the future to join this collective movement that you all have brilliantly, carved the path for? Give them a step forward that they can leave today's discussion with. I'd love to start with Steph, and then we'll go Councilwoman and then Crystal to finish off.
the sooner you find other people who share your views and who you organize with, the better off the world will be in terms of you achieving your climate goals. So look in your community. Are there any organizations around climate solutions that have started, and can you get involved in that way? Also tell people, every time there's a natural disaster like the tragedy that we're seeing in Maui and across the world with heat waves, like remind people that climate change is exacerbating natural disasters. And also there are solutions to that, which is that we all need to stop using fossil fuels, and we not need to elect elected officials like the Councilwoman here who are advocating climate solutions. And then lastly, I would say that take any little step in your own organization where you work, even if it's not related to climate, to ask if you can help bring about climate solutions. Even if you work in a company that has no relation to climate change, you can help them buy clean energy. You can help them bring more diverse leaders into the organization, which will change the power dynamics in which you work. Like, we can all do little things that shift power towards distributed power as opposed to centralized power. And lastly, don't be afraid to be like a 30 or 38-year-old intern in doing something new. It's okay to start new things. And as long as you find good people to do it with you, which you always will, if you put yourself out there and start talking to people, like build your community, and you will do things that you couldn't have imagined doing alone.
Incredible. And then we'll go with Councilwoman Keani Rawlins.
Mahalo for this question, and mahalo nui again for this incredible panel. This, when we talk about like filling, our energy, our own energy systems, like these kinds of groups really fill my cup. So, mahalo for everything that everyone is sharing. So everything that Steph said, do online searches to see, what organizations, what individuals, sometimes elected officials will put themselves out as, champions for this cause. Connect with them. I think, what Crystal shared earlier about just staying curious. As Steph said, there's a lot to learn. It'll be a steep learning curve. But as long as you stay curious and you stay humble, and, I think you'll find that it's so invigorating to do this work. I think for those that continue to be in denial about the reality of climate change, we can just point to our human systems that we've built, our human-built environment, and how it is not working for us. It is killing people. It is devastating our landscape. And regardless of whether they want to accept that that is a symptom and an outcome of climate change, it doesn't matter, because what we're experiencing as communities, the impacts, the devastation is real, and that is not deniable. And in West Maui, where I'm going to be heading in about an hour to deliver supplies to our communities there, there's been no rain. It's been dry conditions. The power lines fell with trees from the hurricane gusts. It knocked down the power lines on the dry grass, sparked fires everywhere. The fire, it spread so quickly. People were jumping into the ocean to escape the fire because it spread way faster than anyone expected. So these are things that is undeniable. And so anyone that's denying climate change, you can point to all these realities, and you don't have to argue whether climate change is real or not. These disasters are real. And I want to thank all of you again for having me on this panel. and our audience for watching and for asking questions, for being engaged. Continue to stay engaged. Hold your elected officials accountable. Work with them, reach out to those who share your values, and you'll find many partnerships. Mahalo.
And I'll also add on to that by saying that do everything you can to follow the leaders in the front line. Do everything you can to find them, to support them if you can, to support them by following them on social media, following them on their email newsletter. Do everything you can. If even better, if you can be volunteer or work for them, but likely there's capacity limitation, because why follow the frontline leader? Because the world that we live in, I'll just bring the quote from Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman says that she could have saved so many more people if they knew that they were enslaved. We live in a world where we don't know what is going on. I'll use some quick example, carbon footprint, the concept of carbon footprint. Google it if you don't already know. It's a scam that has been created by the oil company, BP company, worked with Ogilvy Mathers to create this concept to distract us from the problem and move the responsibility to consumer. And that is a problem. Now, the entire foundation of the argument for climate solution is based on decarbonization. So the mentality and understanding of how we look at the world is key. Same thing, consumerism. Our role is being treated as consumers. We've been told for more than 100 years to just sit back and do nothing and consume and pay our bills. And this is the outcome. So if you want to change all of that things that we live in, it's not because we're bad people. It's because this is the reality that we live in. And only if we break out of the worldview and change the worldview of what is possible. And this is not about the new worldview. It's about re-indigenizing and connecting to what our ancestors have been doing for thousands of years, that the people in the front line have been continuing to hold. And I've been saying that this system is sending in the wrong side of history, and we just need to turn back and be with the people who's been saying that and leading that. So thank you all so much for being here and being in this very important topic about AAPI, because we're touching into our ancestry, to think back about how do we re-indigenize ourselves, reconnect and remember our relationship with energy and each other.
Woo, amazing. I feel like this is one of the most powerful webinars I've been on in a while. I think you all have really moved and inspired me, and I'm sure so many people who have watched this and will watch this are going to be transformed by your words and your stories today. And just really grateful to have shared this space with just such incredible and powerful AAPI women, and to get to talk about the topic of energy justice at such a time when Maui is in crisis. It is a time for all of us to mobilize our resources and our energy, for those of us who are allies, to amplify and support that cause right now as it's happening. So make sure to stay tuned with the resources we listed in the chat. Make sure to stay in touch with Energy Allies. Please stay in touch with me. I'm Kristy Drutman with Brown Girl Green and Green Jobs Board, and all of our incredible panelists will be sending out information following this event for you to stay in touch and to stay resource educated and to take care of your communities. So thank you all so much for sharing space with us today. I hope you gained such amazing insights as I did, and stay safe out there as well. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Have a good weekend.